Hey guys, tonight we trade heroic tales of polar discovery for a frostbitten dose of reality. The surprisingly dull chores on early 20th century Arctic expeditions. Picture this: you're not planting a flag at the pole in a blaze of glory. You're in a cramped, smoky hut, and your heroic deed might be thawing your boots or chipping ice for tea without losing a finger. Forget stirring accounts of daring do. We're focusing on the relentless, numbing grind of daily survival that underpinned every famed expedition. And let's be honest, between sub-zero temperatures, a diet of pemmican and despair, and no modern plumbing, you probably won't survive this imaginary journey without a deep appreciation for central heating and an urge to hug a radiator. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always fascinating to see our global night owl community. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first sensation that claws its way into your reluctant consciousness isn't the inspiring call of adventure, but the aching, bitter cold. It seeps through your layers of reindeer fur or woolen blankets, a tangible presence that nips at your nose, your ears, and, most alarmingly, your toes. You burrow deeper into your sleeping bag, a cocoon of relative warmth that you know, with a sinking heart, you'll have to abandon far too soon. Your first coherent thought upon waking isn't usually, "What great geographical discoveries shall I contribute to mankind today?" but more along the lines of, "Right. Are all 10 of my toes still currently attached to my feet? And if so, can any of them actually feel the abstract concept of profound regret yet?" It's a daily gamble. Through a tiny opening in your bag, you glimpse the interior of your shelter. Perhaps a cramped wooden hut, its walls thick with hoarfrost that glitters mockingly in the dim light of a sputtering oil lamp. Or the claustrophobic confines of a canvas tent, the fabric stiff and unyielding as iron. Or maybe you're still aboard the expedition ship, trapped fast in the relentless grip of the pack ice. The groans of the timbers a constant, mournful soundtrack to your existence. Frozen condensation coats every surface, forming delicate, icy lacework on the inside of windows or tent flaps, a beautiful, if deeply uncomfortable, reminder of the minus 30, 40, or even 50 degrees Celsius that patiently awaits you, just beyond your thin layers of protection. The air smells stale, a potent cocktail of unwashed bodies, lamp oil, cooked seal blubber, damp wool, and the faint, lingering aroma of everyone's collective will to live slowly but surely evaporating. It's unique. You could probably bottle it and sell it as ode to existential Arctic despair. If it's the long polar night, then darkness is your constant companion, a heavy, indifferent blanket pressing down on the world. If it's the season of the midnight sun, or perhaps just a regular Arctic dawn, the light that filters in is pale, weak, and singularly unenthusiastic. The sun, if it bothers to show up at all during this particular phase of your glorious expedition, often just peeks tentatively over the frozen horizon with all the cheerfulness of someone forced to attend a mandatory early morning international committee meeting about the precise definition of ice, which, to be perfectly fair, is pretty much your entire upcoming daily agenda. Many early 20th century Arctic expeditions, despite their lofty aims of geographical discovery, scientific advancement, or national prestige, involved incredibly long periods of intense, mind-numbing cold, profound isolation, and a severely monotonous daily routine, where basic survival and the avoidance of frostbite or scurvy often overshadowed any grander heroic pursuits. The stirring tales you read back home, filled with brave flags planted and territories claimed, conveniently glossed over the sheer, grinding boredom and the endless, unglamorous toil. The thought of emerging from your sleeping bag is physically painful. Every fiber of your being screams in protest. But duty, and the even more pressing need to eventually relieve your bladder, calls. There's often a quirky, unspoken ritual amongst you and your companions, a sort of grimly determined race to dress to minimize the agonizing period of exposure to the hut's frigid interior air before the stove. If you're lucky enough to have one that's behaving, can be coaxed into providing a semblance of warmth. It involves a lot of frantic, shivering contortions as you try to pull on layers of frozen stiff wool and fur. A performance that would be comical if it weren't so deeply, uncomfortably real. As you lie there, like steeling yourself for the inevitable icy shock, you might idly ponder the narratives that will emerge from this venture. Historians still argue when poring over the often laconic and stoic expedition diaries from this era, whether the extreme emphasis on uncomplaining endurance and the glossing over of personal suffering was a genuine reflection of the explorer's unyielding Victorian or Edwardian character and stiff upper lip mentality, or if it was a carefully constructed public narrative designed to uphold heroic ideals. Secure future funding and tactfully mask underlying despair, interpersonal tensions, and the sheer, crushing weight of daily misery. Your current inclination, as you tentatively wiggle a toe that feels suspiciously like a small, detached icicle, is to lean heavily towards the carefully constructed narrative theory. But ponderings, however insightful, won't get the chores done. And chores, an endless, unglamorous parade of them, are what define your days in this frozen, unforgiving realm. The frozen sunrise, such as it is, has arrived, bringing with it not a surge of adventurous spirit, but the cold, hard, and often painfully frost-bitten reality of another identical day of Arctic drudgery. Your toes, predictably, are frozen. The day's unglamorous schedule awaits. You've somehow survived the initial brutal shock of Pekinut Coconut, leaving the relative sanctuary of your sleeping bag, and even managed to wrestle your protesting limbs into layers of frozen, stiff clothing. Your toes are still staging a silent, numb rebellion, but there's no time to negotiate terms of surrender with them just yet. The first, most pressing, and utterly unglamorous chore of this, and every other, God-forsaken Arctic day awaits procuring fresh water. It sounds so simple, and one doesn't it? Turn on a tap, fill a kettle. But here, in this kingdom of ice, water in its liquid form is a rare and precious commodity, one that must be painstakingly wrested from the frozen landscape through sheer, monotonous, back-breaking effort. Your first romantic encounter of the day, therefore, is not with a breathtaking polar vista, though those are certainly around. If you had the energy or inclination to appreciate them through the frost on your eyelashes, but with a very large, very stubborn block of ancient ice that seems to take personal offense at your attempts to convert it into the morning's lukewarm tea. Procuring fresh water was a constant, laborious, and absolutely critical necessity on all early 20th century Arctic expeditions, typically involving the daily, repetitive task of melting large quantities of carefully selected snow or, more often, hacking blocks of old, dense freshwater ice from glaciers, icebergs, or frozen lakes, as naturally occurring liquid water was scarce or entirely non-existent for much of the year. Forget plumbing, your water source is the solid heart of the polar world itself, bundled against the biting wind, which always seems to find the one tiny gap in your meticulously layered defenses. You trudge out of the hut or ship's cabin, armed with an ice axe, a sturdy canvas sack, or perhaps a saw if you're tackling particularly dense, old ice. If you're lucky, there's a supply of pre-chopped ice blocks near the shelter, the result of yesterday's equally arduous labor. If not, it's off to the designated ice quarry, a nearby pressure ridge, the edge of a glacier, or a patch of clean, compacted snow. The landscape is a stark, monochrome masterpiece of white and gray, beautiful in its desolation, but offering little comfort as you begin the day's grind. The physical act of chopping or sawing the ice is a brutal assault on your already chilled body. Each swing of the axe sends jarring vibrations up your arms. Your breath rasps in the frigid air, crystallizing instantly on your beard or scarf. Your fingers, even encased in thick mittens, quickly become numb and clumsy. The ice itself is unyielding, shattering grudgingly under your blows, shards flying like angry diamonds. Or, if you're gathering snow, it's an endless scooping, packing it tightly into sacks, trying to get enough volume to yield a decent amount of water, as snow is mostly air. The daily quest for water, it's like being a very cold, very underpaid Sisyphus. But instead of a mythological rock, you're wrestling with belligerent chunks of cryosphere. And instead of a steep hill, it's just more ice, stretching to an indifferent horizon. And at the end of all that effort, your glorious reward is a pannikin of lukewarm, often slightly sooty, water, the sheer, unadulterated glamour of polar exploration. Once you've hacked or gathered your frozen bounty, it's hauled back to the relative shelter of your cramped living quarters. Now begins the slow, tedious process of melting. A large pot is placed over the precious, temperamental Primus stove, or perhaps a blubber stove if you're truly roughing it, and chunks of ice or handfuls of snow are gradually added. It's an agonizingly slow transformation. You hover over it, feeding the stove, adding more frozen material, waiting for the first precious drops to appear, then a trickle, then finally a usable quantity of water. This water will be used for everything drinking, making tea or coffee if you have such luxuries, rehydrating dried foods like pemmican or biscuits, and if there's any to spare, which there rarely is, a rudimentary wash. You've become, out of sheer necessity and endless repetition, a connoisseur of ice. There's a running deadpan commentary amongst your messmates about the vintage and terroir of different batches. Ah, Perkins, is this today's water from the old blue ice near the stranded iceberg? Or the more pedestrian, shall we say, compacted snowdrift from behind the latrine screen? One can always tell by the subtle aftertaste of fossilized despair. You might even find yourself offering, with a perfectly straight face, your own tasting notes. This particular vintage, I find, gathered from the upper section of that newly calved glacier fragment, possesses a delightful hint of prehistoric atmospheric dust and just a whisper of ancient, frozen penguin guano. Very bracing, excellent clarity. It's these small, shared absurdities, these quirky little in-jokes, that help to keep the encroaching madness at bay. Historians still argue, with the benefit of heated libraries and readily available tap water, whether the common expeditionary choice between using packed snow versus freshwater ice for melting was primarily based on scientific considerations of perceived purity and mineral content or lack thereof, or if it was more often dictated by intensely practical factors such as immediate availability, the relative fuel efficiency for melting each type, and the sheer, bone-wearying physical effort involved in the procurement of sufficient quantities. From your current shivering perspective, it's usually a case of whatever is closest, cleanest looking, and least likely to involve losing a toe to frostbite while acquiring it. And so, the first vital chore of the day is accomplished. You have water, lukewarm, possibly tasting faintly of seal blubber from the stove, but undeniably water. It's a small victory, but a crucial one. The only downside is the certain soul-crushing knowledge that this entire laborious, ice-chopping, snow-gathering, slow-melting daily grind will have to be repeated in just a few short hours, and then again tomorrow, and the day after that. For as long as this glorious, character-building Arctic sojourn continues, your frozen toes offer a silent, throbbing protest. Right. So you've heroically battled the ancient ice gods and emerged victorious with a pot of lukewarm, slightly smoky water? A triumph. Your reward for this epic morning struggle breakfast? And what a breakfast it is. A culinary adventure that will tantalize your taste buds and leave you, well, mostly just feeling slightly less empty and perhaps a tiny bit resentful towards the entire concept of preserved meats. You turn your attention from the now simmering water pot to the expedition's pantry. which is less a pantry and more a carefully guarded, tragically limited collection of items, scientifically designed to provide maximum calories with minimum joy. Ah, breakfast. Today's gourmet offering is, drumroll please, pemmican. And for a thrilling, palate-tingling change of pace from yesterday's pemmican surprise, this particular batch has an extra frisson of, well, it's still just pemmican. Isn't it surprise? The diet on many, if not most, early 20th century Arctic expeditions relied heavily on high energy, preserved foods like pemmican, a concentrated brick of dried, pounded meat, often beef or caribou mixed with rendered fat, and sometimes with dried berries for a hint of je ne sais quoi, and ship's biscuits, also known as hardtack. These foods were prized for their longevity and caloric density, essential for survival in the extreme cold, though their nutritional incompleteness often led to debilitating deficiencies like scurvy if not carefully supplemented with fresh meat when available, or with often inadequate preserved lime juice. So, you hack off a chunk of the pemmican from a larger and frozen block that resembles a particularly unappetizing geological sample. It's so hard your axe, fresh from its icy joust, barely makes a dent. This is where the real upper body workout begins. Preparing this delicacy is an art form. If by art form you mean a desperate attempt to make something fundamentally unappetizing, slightly less so, you might chop the frozen pemmican into smaller pieces with a hatchet, the greasy, meat-scented chips flying about the cramped hut like particularly unhygienic confetti. Some of your more optimistic messmates might attempt to fry these chips in a pan with a bit more rendered fat, creating a sizzling, sputtering, and usually very smoky affair that fills the hut with an aroma that's somewhere between a forgotten abattoir and a very old candle. The more common method, however, is to create hoosh or pemmican duff. Essentially, chucking the chopped pemmican into some of your hard-won hot water and stirring it until it becomes a sort of thick, greasy, vaguely meat-flavored porridge. It's warm, it's calorie-dense, and it has the texture of wet sawdust mixed with tallow. Bon appetit! Accompanying this culinary masterpiece are the ship's biscuits. These aren't your grandma's fluffy buttermilk biscuits. Unless your grandma was a particularly stern quartermaster with a penchant for baking small, inedible beige tiles. These biscuits are monuments to durability, so hard they could probably be used for emergency sledge repairs or as particularly aggressive skipping stones on the rare occasion you find liquid water. They are, almost invariably, riddled with weevils, or at least the memory of weevils, leaving little tunnels and a faint, dusty aftertaste. You learn to tap them vigorously on the table before consumption, a percussive ritual designed to dislodge any current occupants. These biscuits aren't just food, they're multi-purpose polar survival tools. You can use them as emergency paperweights for your increasingly bleak journal entries, small, ineffective shingles to patch a leak in the hut roof, or if you soak one in tea for approximately 3 weeks, a vaguely edible form of self-inflicted punishment. The monotony is the real killer. Every breakfast, every lunch, every dinner features these same star players. Pemmican, biscuits, biscuits, pemmican. Sometimes, for a wild change, you might have tinned bully beef or a smear of precious, slightly rancid butter on your biscuit. But the underlying theme is always the same bland, repetitive, and engineered for fuel. Not fun. The pemmican blues are a recognized medical condition around here, characterized by a profound lack of culinary enthusiasm and an unnerving tendency to stare wistfully at pictures of fruit in outdated magazines. If you even have any. To combat the soul-crushing boredom of it all, some of the men have taken to biscuit art. It's a quirky little pastime. This meticulous carving of the rock-hard biscuits into tiny, intricate sculptures during the long hours of darkness or blizzard-bound confinement. Miniature polar bears, surprisingly detailed portraits of the ship's cat if you have one, or abstract representations of existential despair. It's either that or start having very serious, one-sided conversations with your spoon. You've developed a deep, almost uncomfortably personal relationship with your daily ration of pemmican. It's a bond forged in mutual resignation and the shared, unspoken understanding that neither of you is particularly thrilled to be in the situation, but you're stuck with each other until the bitter, frozen, and quite possibly scurvy-ridden end. Historians still argue, with the benefit of their varied and delicious diets, whether the profound psychological impact of extreme, prolonged dietary monotony on these early expeditions was a more significant contributing factor to declining expedition morale, interpersonal conflict, and even cognitive impairment than even the more obvious physical hardships of extreme cold and relentless labor. Chewing on another mouthful of greasy, fibrous pemmican that tastes vaguely of regret and old socks, you're inclined to think those historians might be onto something. And so, breakfast is consumed, not enjoyed, not savored, but processed. It's fuel in the tank. Nothing more. It provides the calories to face the next round of equally dull, equally essential chores that make up your surprisingly unheroic life in this vast, white, and culinarily challenged wilderness. The ballads you mentally compose are less about brave deeds and more about the infinite textural variations of slightly damp hardtack. The pemmican blues have set in for the day. Breakfast, that thrilling daily festival of pemmican and existential contemplation, is now a greasy, crumb-filled memory. You've successfully ingested enough calories to theoretically prevent immediate hibernation. And the lukewarm, slightly sooty tea has provided a fleeting illusion of internal warmth. So, what's next on the hit parade of unglamorous Arctic chores? Yes, it's time for the meticulous, freezing, and utterly essential task of equipment maintenance. With a special focus today on the prima donnas of polar transport, the sledges. If water is life and pemmican is, well, pemmican, then your sledge is your lifeline, your workhorse, your incredibly temperamental wooden and rawhide best frenemy, and it demands constant, painstaking, and often deeply unpleasant attention. Wooden sledges, often based on traditional Inuit designs or ingeniously adapted by explorers like Fridtjof Nansen, with an emphasis on lightness and flexibility, their runners sometimes shod with whalebone or metal, were absolutely essential for hauling the immense loads of food, fuel, scientific instruments, and shelter required to traverse the vast, frozen Arctic terrain during these early 20th century expeditions. Without a well-maintained sledge, you're not going anywhere except, possibly into a state of profound, stationary despair, which, to be fair, is often your default state anyway, but the sledge at least offers the illusion of progress. Today's special joy is greasing the runners. This isn't a quick spray of WD-40, mind you. This is an intimate, hands-on and hands-freezing encounter with large quantities of congealed animal fat. The purpose is to reduce the crippling friction between the sledge runners and the various delightful forms of snow and ice you'll encounter, from deep, powdery drifts that suck at the runners like frozen quicksand, to sharp, jagged sastrugi that try to rip them to shreds. A well-greased runner, in theory, glides more smoothly, demands less effort from you and the dogs if you have them, and generally makes the soul-destroying act of hauling hundreds of pounds of gear across a frigid wasteland slightly less soul-destroying. In theory, the grease itself is usually a delightful concoction of rendered seal blubber, walrus fat, or perhaps even bear grease if a hunt has been particularly unfortunate for the bear. It's stored in tins or barrels, and in this temperature, it's usually frozen solid, resembling a giant, off-white, vaguely fishy candle. Your first task is to chip off enough of this Arctic lubricant and perhaps try to gently warm it over the Primus stove. A dangerous game that often results in either still frozen grease or a sudden, alarming flare-up of burning blubber that coats everything in a new layer of oily soot. Ah, sledge maintenance. Your favorite part of the day, right after voluntarily chipping ice directly into your eyeballs with your teeth for sport, and listening to Perkins from accounting, who inexplicably signed up for this recount, his incredibly detailed dream about a sentient, philosophical walrus that questioned the inherent morality of polar exploration. It's all about embracing the glamour of the frontier. Once the grease is of a vaguely spreadable, if still aggressively cold and uncooperative, consistency, you begin the application. This involves kneeling in the snow, your breath instantly crystallizing on your muffler, and laboriously smearing the sticky, smelly unguent onto the full length of each runner with your mittened, or for better control and subsequent instant frost nip, bare hands. The official expedition manual, probably written by someone in a warm London office who once saw a picture of snow, no doubt says something encouraging like, apply grease evenly and thinly for optimal glide characteristics. Your frozen fingers, the stubbornly congealed lump of what might be seal blubber, or might equally be ancient, repurposed candle wax, and the biting wind that's trying to steal your very soul through your ear holes, usually have a slightly different interpretation of this instruction. This interpretation generally involves more swearing, uneven, angry smears of grease, and a profound questioning of all your life choices up to this point. And it's not just the runners. There's the constant gear grief of checking and rechecking every lashing, every strap, every wooden strut of the sledge frame. The intense cold makes wood brittle, leather stiff and prone to cracking, and metal a cruel conductor of precious body heat. You're constantly on the lookout for splits, frays, or weaknesses that could lead to a catastrophic failure miles from shelter. You might spend an hour carefully restitching a rawhide binding with numb fingers, or trying to tighten a frozen nut with a clumsy, over-mittened hand. It's meticulous, vital, and about as exciting as watching paint freeze, which, come to think of it, is something you also get to do quite a lot around here. There are, of course, closely guarded secrets and whispered expeditionary folklore regarding the perfect sledge runner grease recipe. Old Man Hemlock, the grizzled second mate, swears by adding a handful of crushed ship's biscuit crumbs for improved traction and a certain nutty aroma that repels polar bears. Young Ainsworth, the expedition's optimistic geologist, champions a blend incorporating a minuscule, carefully hoarded drop of his grandmother's lavender water, claiming it soothes the wood and encourages a harmonious glide. These quirky, utterly ineffective, and often quite bizarre concoctions are discussed with the utmost seriousness, a testament to the human need to find some agency, some magic, in the face of overwhelming, greasy monotony. You've named your own sledge the inevitable disappointment. It seems to appreciate the honesty, or maybe that ominous creaking sound it makes every time you load it is just the wood slowly giving up on the very concept of life. Much like your own dwindling hopes for a warm bath and a meal that doesn't taste primarily of fat. Historians still argue, often in heated academic conferences presumably supplied with excellent biscuits and readily available hot beverages, whether the persistent and often mission-critical mechanical failures of sledges and other essential equipment on some of these pioneering expeditions were primarily due to the inherent limitations of the materials and design principles of the era, when faced with such extreme and poorly understood environmental conditions, or if they were significantly exacerbated by factors such as inadequate pre-expedition testing, insufficient maintenance protocols under duress, or simply the overwhelming physical and mental fatigue of the men tasked with their upkeep. Looking at the state of your current grease job, a lumpy, uneven masterpiece of frozen frustration, you're willing to bet it's a delightful combination of all of the above. But eventually, the task is done. The runners are as greased as they're going to get. The lashings are as tight as your numb fingers can make them. Your sledge is, theoretically, ready for whatever icy hellscape lies ahead. This freezing, sticky, and endlessly repetitive maintenance is yet another uncelebrated but absolutely crucial component of your Arctic survival. A dull chore ensuring that when you eventually do have to move, you can do so with just slightly less friction-induced despair and a marginally reduced chance of something critical snapping in half at the worst possible moment. Right. The sledges are now as optimally greased as humanly possible with frozen fingers and what amounts to solidified fish-scented candle wax. Their runners gleam with a dull, greasy sheen, promising marginally less soul-destroying friction on your next jolly jaunt across the icy wilderness. You straighten up, your back protesting with a series of pops and creaks that echo the groans of the ship timbers, and turn your attention from the great outdoors to the great indoors, or rather the small, cramped, and aggressively ungreat indoors of your shared living quarters. It's time for that most thrilling, most rewarding of all polar expeditionary tasks. Hut tidying, a truly frozen farce, if ever there was one. Your abode, be it a prefabricated wooden hut brought painstakingly from home, a hastily constructed snow house, or the slightly less than luxurious confines of a ship deliberately frozen into the pack ice for the winter, is a marvel of condensed living. And by condensed, you mean crammed with too many men, too much gear, and an ever-increasing patina of grime that seems to possess its own stubborn sentience. Living quarters on early 20th century Arctic expeditions, regardless of their specific construction, were typically extremely cramped, often poorly ventilated, and notoriously difficult to keep clean, leading to persistent issues with smoke and soot from blubber lamps or Primus stoves. Pervasive dampness from condensation and tracked-in snow, and an olfactory tapestry woven from unwashed bodies. Cooking fumes, drying woolen garments, and the faint underlying scent of impending despair. It's cozy, in a sardines packed in a very old, very smoky tin kind of way. Time for the weekly, or perhaps optimistically daily. Grand Hut. Tidy up extravaganza. Today's exciting primary objective to heroically rearrange the existing layers of grime into slightly more aesthetically pleasing, perhaps even abstract patterns. And if fortune truly smiles upon you, to finally locate that one particularly comfortable sock you're fairly certain you lost somewhere around last Tuesday's blizzard. Spoilers, the sock is probably now a permanent, deeply embedded, and quite possibly load-bearing, frozen feature of interior wall decoration number 3, lovingly preserved for future bewildered archaeologists. Your primary cleaning implement is usually a stiff, elderly broom, its bristles sparse and worn down from valiant, but ultimately futile, battles against the encroaching tide of polar detritus. It sheds more of its own bristles than it actually collects in terms of dirt, snow, ice crystals, pemmican crumbs, stray dog hairs if you have canine companions, and miscellaneous unidentifiable bits of fluff. It's less a functional tool of hygiene and more a symbolic wand, waved with a certain theatrical flourish in the general direction of encroaching squalor, signifying good intentions rather than achieving actual cleanliness. You sweep the floor, which is often a patchwork of bare wood, impacted snow, and treacherous sheets of refrozen meltwater, pushing the larger debris into a corner where it will, inevitably, be redistributed by the next gust of wind through a poorly sealed door. Wiping down surfaces, the communal table where you consume your monotonous meals, the edges of your narrow bunks, perhaps a shared bookshelf groaning under the weight of 3 very well-read Bibles and a tattered copy of Advanced Blubber Cookery, is another exercise in determined optimism. Your cleaning rag is usually a piece of old burlap, perpetually damp and quickly freezing solid if you're not careful, and the cleaning agent is, well, more of that precious hard-won meltwater, which mostly just smears the existing layer of soot and grease into a more uniform, if no less present, film. You've developed a new, almost zen-like appreciation for the subtle, abstract beauty of soot. It really brings out the undeniable character of the rough-hewn wooden beams. Yes, character. That's definitely the word for perpetually coated in a greasy, slightly sticky black film that smells faintly of burnt seal oil. One of the more specialized and uniquely Arctic housekeeping chores is the regular interior wall de-icing. The moisture from your breath, from cooking, from melting snow on your clothes, all condenses on the frigid inner walls of the hut, forming thick, crystalline layers of hoarfrost. It's quite beautiful, in a living inside a giant, slightly grubby snow globe kind of way. but it also makes the hut significantly colder and damper. So, periodically, armed with a scraper or just a sturdy biscuit, if you're feeling particularly resourceful, you have to chip and scrape this accumulated frost off the walls. It's a surprisingly energetic task, and you have to be careful not to dislodge a miniature avalanche of ice crystals directly down the back of your neck or into the pot of simmering pemmican hoosh. Success is measured in the temporary reduction of indoor icicles and a slightly less immediate feeling of being entombed. Historians still argue, often from the comfort of their well-dusted studies, whether the documented instances of squalor and sometimes shockingly poor hygiene reported in the diaries and logs of some early Arctic expedition shelters were primarily the unavoidable and inevitable consequences of operating in such an extreme and unforgiving environment with severely limited resources for cleanliness, or if they sometimes reflected a more troubling decline in expedition morale, a breakdown of discipline, and the psychological erosion of the men's capacity or will to maintain basic standards under prolonged, intense duress. Looking around your current abode, with its unique olfactory signature and its artfully distressed soot and ice-based decor, you can see valid points on both sides of that particular scholarly debate. Sometimes you just lack the energy or the adequately thawed water to care if the floor has achieved a new level of fossilized food spillage. Yet, the ritual of tidying, however farcical, continues. It's a small, defiant act against the overwhelming entropy of the Arctic, a fragile attempt to impose a sliver of human order on an environment that is inherently chaotic and utterly indifferent to your notions of cleanliness or comfort. It's a battle you will never truly win, but the act of fighting it, of sweeping the unsweepable and wiping the unwipeable, is perhaps, in its own absurd way, a testament to the stubborn, unyielding, and occasionally very grimy human spirit. Or maybe you just really, really want to find that other sock. The heroic, if largely symbolic, battle against hut grime has been fought, and you've achieved a state that could charitably be described as less actively filthy than before. You've even managed to locate what might be a sock, or possibly a very stiff, mummified piece of forgotten pemmican. Progress. But there's no time to rest on your domestic laurels because the Arctic, in its infinite generosity, always has another delightful, unglamorous chore lined up for you. And today, judging by the fresh, pungent aroma beginning to waft from the vicinity of the blubber stove, and the determined, slightly greasy look on Nobby Clark's face. Nobby being the expedition's unofficial, self-appointed, and largely unthanked blubber baron? It's Blubber Rendering Day. Blubber Rendering Day. The day the entire Arctic expedition collectively decides that smelling like the inside of a very old, very deceased whale's discarded, well-used ashtray is the absolute pinnacle of polar chic. It's an acquired taste. This particular olfactory experience. And smell. Mostly, it's the smell. Now, blubber. The thick layer of fat found beneath the skin of marine mammals like seals, walruses, and whales if your expedition has been particularly ambitious or fortunate in its hunting, is Arctic gold. Not the shiny, pretty kind. Obviously, this is the greasy, smelly, life-sustaining kind. Rendered animal fat, primarily from seals and walruses due to their relative abundance and accessibility, was a absolutely critical resource on many early 20th century Arctic expeditions, serving as the primary fuel for lamps that provided precious light during the long polar night, and for stoves used for heating, cooking, and the endless vital task of melting snow and ice for drinking water. It was also a vital high-calorie food source for both the men and their indispensable sledge dogs, providing the energy needed to survive the extreme cold and physical exertion. Without blubber, your lamps go out, your stove goes cold, your water supply dries up or rather freezes solid, and your chances of seeing next spring plummet faster than a clumsy penguin off an ice floe. The process begins, as many delightful things do in the Arctic, with a successful, if rather grim, hunt. Once the animal is dispatched and hauled back to camp, a bloody, freezing, and exhausting task in itself, the flensing begins. Thick slabs of the white or yellowish blubber are cut from the carcass. A slippery, messy job that coats your knives, your mittens, and inevitably, your already fragrant outer garments in a layer of cooling grease. These slabs are then chopped into more manageable chunks, ready for the great meltdown. This is where Nobby, your expeditions aforementioned, Blubber Baron truly shines, or rather, reeks. He has, through some unfortunate quirk of fate, or perhaps a complete lack of any other discernible useful skills, apart from an uncanny tolerance for appalling smells, become the acknowledged and generally much avoided when he's on-duty expert at this particular aromatic art form. He approaches the large, soot-blackened rendering pot, usually set up outside if the weather isn't actively trying to flay you alive, or in a very specific, downwind corner of the hut if it is, with a look of grim determination and, you sometimes suspect, a perverse sort of pride in the unique olfactory signature he's about to unleash upon the immediate environment. He has his own little rituals, his own preferred blubber chunk size, his own way of coaxing the fire beneath the pot to the perfect, slow rendering heat. The smoke from the blubber pot, once it really gets going, is legendary. It's so thick, so black, so acrid. You could practically carve your initials in it, which someone, probably young Henderson during a moment of oxygen-deprived whimsy, almost certainly has. In fact, that might be what actually happened to Henderson's other missing mitten. It's now a permanent, greasy, three-dimensional art installation suspended in the atmospheric strata just above the hut's main chimney. As the blubber chunks heat, they begin to sizzle and pop, slowly yielding their precious oil. The smell intensifies, a complex bouquet of burning fat, singed meat, ancient fish, and something else. Something uniquely, unforgettably, blubbery. It clings to your clothes, your hair, your beard, your very soul. You will taste it in your tea for days. Your dreams will be narrated by it. It is the perfume of Arctic survival. The rich reward of this process is the clear, golden, or sometimes rather murky brown oil that is carefully skimmed off and stored in tins or barrels. This is your liquid sunshine for the long night, your fuel for life. The leftover crispy bits, the cracklings, are sometimes eaten by the men as a fatty, if somewhat gritty, delicacy, or more often fed to the dogs, who seem to consider them gourmet treats. Bless their undiscerning canine palates. Historians and medical researchers still argue, often by examining the somewhat sparse medical logs and later life health records of these early explorers, whether the significant and prolonged exposure to the dense soot and acrid fumes generated from burning blubber in poorly ventilated lamps and stoves was a substantial but often underdocumented contributing factor to chronic respiratory illnesses or other long-term health detriments in these men. Quite apart from the more immediate and well-known polar risks of frostbite, scurvy, and accidental immolation by an overturned blubber lamp. Looking at the oily black cloud currently engulfing Nobby and the north end of the hut, you can't help but feel those historians might have a point. They say blubber oil is liquid sunshine for the long Arctic night. A poetic, if somewhat optimistic description. You, personally, after your third consecutive week of smelling like you've been intimately marinating inside a deceased marine mammal, tend to think of it more as liquid olfactory assault with a persistent, clinging side order of existential despair? But hey, at least it keeps the lamp burning, allowing you to read your one tattered copy of Collected Sermons by candlelight. Most of the time, when it doesn't just decide to flare up unexpectedly and engulf the entire hut in a cloud of oily, unbreathable, and highly flammable doom. Good times. This smelly, messy, and utterly essential chore is a cornerstone of your existence here. A rich reward only in the starkest, most practical sense it allows you to see, to cook, and to not immediately freeze to death, albeit while smelling absolutely, unequivocally, and unforgettably appalling. the rich, pervasive aroma of freshly rendered blubber, a scent that will now affectionately cling to your clothing, your hair, and your very soul for the foreseeable future, finally begins to dissipate. Or perhaps your olfactory senses have simply waved a tiny white flag of surrender. Nobby Clark, the expedition's undisputed and deeply fragrant blubber baron, is presumably admiring his barrels of newly acquired lamp oil, looking like a particularly greasy and self-satisfied monarch. You, however, have retreated to the relative, and I use that term with extreme generosity, olfactory neutrality of the main hut, seeking solace in another vital, if equally unglamorous, chore. It's time for an intimate, ongoing session of darning dreams and woolly woes. Yes, the thrilling, action-packed adventure of mending your perpetually disintegrating socks and mittens. In this kingdom of relentless, biting cold, your woolen garments are not mere accessories, they are your first, and often last, line of defense against the ever-present threat of frostbite. Your thick knitted socks, your multi-layered mittens, your balaclavas, scarves, and jumpers. These are the unsung heroes of Arctic survival. Wool was a primary material for cold weather clothing on nearly all early 20th century polar expeditions due to its exceptional insulating properties, its ability to retain warmth even when damp, and its general robustness. But it was also notoriously prone to wear and tear under harsh expeditionary conditions, requiring constant, meticulous mending by the men themselves. Many of these items were lovingly hand-knitted by mothers, wives, sisters, or sweethearts back home, imbued not just with lanolin but with prayers and fond wishes. This adds a certain poignant urgency to keeping them intact. Each fraying thread feels like a tiny betrayal of that distant affection. The woolly woes are relentless. The constant friction from your heavy, ill-fitting boots wears holes in your socks with alarming speed. Hauling on sledge ropes, chipping ice and wrestling with frozen canvas tears at your mittens, snagging your jumper on a protruding nail in the hut, or a sharp edge of a provision box is a minor catastrophe. And then there's the general, mysterious attrition that seems to affect all woolen items in sub-zero temperatures, as if the cold itself has tiny, invisible teeth that just love to nibble away at your precious insulation. The misery of pulling on a damp, holey sock on a 40-degree morning, feeling that icy draft directly on your skin, is a sensation that inspires a truly profound commitment to the art of the darning needle. Your social life in the Arctic, you often reflect as you thread a piece of coarse yarn with a numb, fumbling finger, has become an intimate, ongoing, and often rather one-sided relationship with a darning needle and a sock that appears to be actively, almost maliciously, trying to disintegrate out of sheer spite. It's a classic love-hate dynamic, mostly hate from the sock's perspective, you strongly suspect. The darning process itself is a slow, meticulous, and often frustrating ritual, especially when undertaken in the dim, flickering light of a blubber lamp or by the weak, watery daylight filtering through an ice-crusted window. Your tools are simple: a sturdy needle, often kept tucked into your cap for safekeeping, and a dwindling supply of woolen yarn, sometimes salvaged from truly irreparable garments, or carefully rationed from the expedition stores. You sit hunched on your bunk or a crate, your fingers stiff with cold, carefully weaving the yarn back and forth across the offending hole, trying to create a patch that is both warm and durable, and doesn't result in a giant, uncomfortable lump that will later torment your foot for miles of sledging. The feel of the rough, oily wool, the occasional sharp prick of the needle when your numb fingers misjudge. The quiet, focused concentration required, it's a stark contrast to the heroic narratives of polar exploration. Yet, it's in these long, quiet hours of mending that the darning dreams often take hold. As your hands move in their repetitive, almost hypnotic rhythm, your mind is free to wander. You drift back to memories of home, to the warmth of a crackling fireplace, the scent of baking bread, the faces of loved ones. You might replay past triumphs or agonize over past mistakes. You might even find yourself composing epic, internal sagas about the secret life of weevils in the ship's biscuits, or developing complex philosophical theories based on the patterns of frost on the window pane. It's a form of meditative escape, a way to endure the crushing monotony. Sometimes, this darning becomes a communal activity. A few of you gathered around the weak warmth of the stove, needles clicking, conversation muted, a shared, unspoken understanding of this necessary, unheroic toil. There's an unofficial master darner on your expedition, old Stitch Evans, a quiet, weather-beaten whaler whose repairs are legendary for their intricate neatness and almost supernatural durability. Men will subtly try to leave their most challenging sock catastrophes accidentally near his bunk, hoping he'll take pity on their clumsy efforts. You've darned so many holes in your current pair of mittens. They're now approximately 70% carefully interwoven darning yarn, 20% original, rather forlorn-looking wool, and 10% irremovable fossilized biscuit crumbs. It's the very latest in polar expeditionary fashion, deconstructed despair chic. You call it very avant-garde. Historians still argue, with the benefit of their intact socks and centrally heated offices, whether the significant amount of time and mental energy devoted by expedition members to these seemingly mundane domestic tasks like extensive mending was ultimately a contributing factor to psychological strain and a sense of wasted potential due to its inherent tediousness and unheroic nature, or if it actually provided a crucial grounding routine, a tangible sense of accomplishment, however small, and a necessary distraction that helped maintain mental stability and cohesion in the face of extreme environmental pressures, isolation, and gnawing uncertainty. Holding up a sock that now boasts more darns than original fabric, you can see both sides. It's maddeningly dull, but there's also a grim satisfaction in knowing your toes might survive another day without turning into icy casualties. The expedition motto, you've often thought, shouldn't be some lofty Latin phrase about conquering by endurance. It should be something far more practical. Something like, by endurance, we conquer, and by constant, agonizing, mind-numbing darning, we endeavor to keep our extremities from actually snapping off like frozen carrots. It's less catchy, certainly, but infinitely more accurate. And so, the quiet battle continues, waged not with ice axes against glaciers, but with a humble needle and thread against the relentless attrition of the Arctic cold. A woolly woe that demands endless patience and dreams of a world where socks magically mend themselves. Your fingers, still slightly stiff and bearing the noble scars of your recent valiant battle against disintegrating sock heels, are now called to a higher, more intellectual, yet often equally tedious, purpose. The darning needle is set aside, perhaps with a sigh of relief or merely a sigh of one repetitive task down. 7 more to go. It's time for the reading rituals. Specifically, the daily, or sometimes hourly, tryst with the expedition's array of sensitive and invariably freezing scientific instruments. If you're lucky, this involves squinting at a thermometer inside the hut. If you're less lucky, which is most of the time, it means venturing out into the biting wind to commune with the meteorological screen. Ah, the glamour of polar science. Early 20th century polar expeditions, alongside their often more celebrated aims of geographical discovery and national prestige, frequently carried significant scientific objectives. Meteorology, geomagnetism, glaciology, atmospheric studies, and even rudimentary marine biology were common fields of inquiry, all requiring regular, meticulous, and often labor-intensive data collection by the expedition members, regardless of their primary roles. So, even if your official title is Third Assistant Sledge Grease Applicator and Biscuit Morale Officer, chances are you've been roped into taking readings. Today's exciting forecast you can already predict with chilling accuracy before even looking at the instruments is still very, very cold. Wind direction predominantly from the place that is also very, very and quite possibly even more cold. At that point, barometric pressure probably critically depressed and showing no signs of imminent cheerfulness. Much like everyone else currently residing in this particular icy purgatory, you approach the meteorological screen, a Stevenson screen perhaps, that white louvered box on stilts designed to protect the delicate thermometers from direct sunlight. A hilarious concept for half the year and precipitation, while still allowing for accurate air temperature readings. Opening its frozen door with a mittened hand that feels more like a clumsy wooden club is the first challenge. Inside, nestled like fragile, hibernating spirits, are the thermometers. Maximum, minimum, wet bulb, dry bulb. You handle each delicate glass tube with the kind of exaggerated care usually reserved for diffusing an unexploded bomb or trying to reason with a particularly sensitive and heavily armed Olympian deity. Dropping one of these on the frozen ground would mean not only the loss of a valuable instrument, but also a very long, very cold lecture from a very unhappy chief scientist, and probably being tasked with attempting to measure the ambient air temperature for the rest of the expedition using only your own increasingly frostbitten earlobe as a sensor. Reading the tiny markings, the almost invisible thread of mercury or alcohol, in the dim, flat light of the Arctic, with snow swirling around your head and your eyelashes rapidly accumulating a picturesque but vision-obscuring layer of ice, is an exercise in extreme patience and optical fortitude. You squint. You breathe warm air onto the glass which immediately refreezes. Naturally, you try to hold your notebook steady with fingers that have lost all meaningful sensation. Then, the meticulous recording of the data, each number painstakingly entered into the logbook with a pencil stub that's constantly threatening to snap, or with ink that's doing its level best to turn into a tiny, uncooperative glacier in its pot, and the numbers themselves. Oh, the thrilling variety. Yesterday minus 35 Celsius. Today minus 35.2 Celsius. The day before minus 34.9 Celsius. The sheer, unadulterated drama of it all is sometimes quite overwhelming. It's not just temperatures. There's the barometer, usually housed inside to prevent it from simply giving up and shattering from the sheer atmospheric despair. Old Fitzwilliam, the expedition's meteorologist, a man whose beard seems to have its own miniature glacial system developing within it, has a quirky little habit of talking to the barometer before taking a reading. He'll tap it gently, murmur encouraging phrases like, "Now, now, old fellow, let's see some upward movement today. Shall we?" A nice bit of high pressure would be just the ticket. As if the instrument were a recalcitrant, but ultimately well-meaning elderly relative. You're not sure it helps the accuracy of the readings, but it does provide a moment of gentle, if slightly unhinged, entertainment. Then there are the magnetic readings, the aurora observations if you're lucky enough to have darkness and a display, perhaps even tide gauge measurements if you're near open, or at least crackable water. Each requires its own specific, repetitive procedure, its own set of delicate, cold-hating instruments, its own battle against numb fingers and dwindling enthusiasm. You're pretty sure the complex magnetic readings you so painstakingly record are just a detailed log of the North Magnetic Pole's increasingly desperate attempts to subtly escape the sheer, mind-numbing boredom of being constantly stared at by shivering men wielding brass instruments and muttering about declination. Still here, are they, drat? Activate evasive magnetic wobble sequence. Try again tomorrow. Historians still argue, often with access to far more sophisticated meteorological data and climate models than were ever dreamed of by these early pioneers. Whether the vast quantities of scientific data so laboriously collected under such extreme duress and with often rudimentary, constantly malfunctioning instrumentation on many of these early polar expeditions ultimately yielded truly significant, paradigm-shifting breakthroughs in global scientific understanding, or if its primary long-term value was in establishing crucial baseline observations for future research, and, perhaps more importantly, in fostering and demonstrating a spirit of relentless scientific inquiry in the planet's most hostile and unknown environments? Looking at your logbook, filled with pages and pages of nearly identical numbers that seem to describe a world locked in unchanging frozen stasis, you sometimes lean towards the baseline observations and spirit fostering end of the argument, though your spirit at this particular moment feels less fostered and more thoroughly frost-nipped. But the readings are taken. The numbers are logged. Science, in its slow, cold, incremental way, has been served. This thermometer tedium, these reading rituals, while supposedly for the grand cause of knowledge, often feel like just another verse in the long, monotonous, and slightly out-of-tune ballad of Arctic chores, a duty performed with frozen breath, a stoic sigh, and a dwindling, carefully rationed supply of enthusiasm. Now, what's next on the agenda? Yes, trying to write something, anything, new in the expedition log when absolutely nothing new has actually happened. The excitement is palpable. The last, meticulously recorded, and probably mind-numbingly similar, meteorological reading has been dutifully entered into the official scientific log, your fingers still protesting the brief but brutal exposure to the instrument handling cold. You've successfully quantified the day's particular brand of frigidity, now a new and in some ways more daunting. Blank page awaits your attention, your personal journal, or perhaps your assigned section of the expedition's official narrative log. It's time to immortalize the day's thrilling events, its groundbreaking discoveries, its stirring moments of human drama. Except, of course, there usually haven't been any. Welcome to the soul-crushing embrace of logbook lethargy, where the greatest challenge is not facing down a polar bear, but facing down the sheer, unadulterated emptiness of another identical day and trying to find something, anything, new to say about it. Keeping detailed journals and official logs was a standard, often mandatory, and critically important practice on virtually all early 20th century polar expeditions. These records served as crucial navigational aids, repositories for scientific data, chronicles of daily events and rations consumed, testaments to the expedition's progress or lack thereof, and often formed the primary basis for the sensational published accounts and lecture tours that would follow upon the explorer's hopefully successful return to civilization. Your words, however mundane they may feel to you now, are potentially pieces of history, messages in a frozen bottle. No pressure, then. You settle down in the dim, flickering light of the hut, a precious candle stub, or the smoky blubber lamp casting dancing shadows on the page of your logbook. Your breath plumes in the frigid air before you, even indoors. Your fingers, already stiff from the earlier instrument readings, fumble with the pencil or the pen filled with ink that's perpetually on the verge of freezing solid. The blank page stares back, vast and white and intimidating, much like the landscape outside your frost-rimed window. What to write, dear diary, you might begin with a surge of bleak internal humor. Today, much like yesterday, and indeed the day before that, and very probably much like tomorrow, it was very, very cold. The snow continued its impressive impersonation of, well, snow. We ate pemmican. Again. It was, as ever, an experience. Logbook entry. Day 73, or is it 7:30? Time gets a bit slippery around here of the great white monotony. Weather still offensively cold, with a brisk wind from the direction of even more offensively cold. Scenery remains aggressively, almost judgmentally, white. Pemmican status regrettably extant, and showing no signs of spontaneous transmutation into a warm steak pie. Morale currently exploring previously uncharted depths of the human capacity for meh. End of report. Thrilling stuff for the history books. You're sure you try to be poetic, to capture the stark beauty, the ethereal light. The aurora today, for a fleeting 10 minutes, painted the vast indifferent sky with ethereal, wavering brushstrokes of frozen emerald and ghostly, blood rose pink. What you actually mean is, saw some faint green and rather anemic pink wobbles in the sky. Was still 40 degrees Celsius. My remaining toes were, understandably, deeply unimpressed and continued their silent protest against existence. There's a sort of unspoken, quirky competition amongst some of your messmates, the understated understatement championship. The goal is to describe the day's soul-crushing monotony or minor miseries in the most bland, laconic, and heroically uncomplaining terms possible. Perkins, for instance. After nearly losing 3 fingers while trying to fix a frozen sledge runner in a blizzard, might simply write weather somewhat inclement. Minor digital discomfort experienced during routine equipment maintenance. Tea rations remain adequate. It's a very British, or perhaps just very frozen, form of gallows humor. A way of acknowledging the absurdity without succumbing to outright despair, at least not on paper. Historians still argue, when meticulously dissecting these precious, often fragile primary source documents, whether the often sparse, emotionally restrained, or stoically understated entries found in many explorers' personal diaries from this era reflect a genuine lack of significant daily external events and an ingrained cultural or personal stoicism, or if they frequently represent a conscious or unconscious form of self-censorship, with the writers deliberately downplaying hardships, interpersonal tensions, and their own inner turmoil for a potential future readership, for their superiors, or even to maintain a personal facade of unyielding resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity. Looking at your own current entry, which reads simply, wind, cold, pemmican, repeat, you feel you could contribute significantly to that debate. Sometimes, there just isn't anything more to say that won't either sound like a desperate plea for rescue or cause your frozen ink to crack from the sheer intensity of your unexpressed ennui. The struggle is to find variety in the invariable. You might dedicate a paragraph to a particularly interesting ice crystal you observed, or the subtle shift in the sound of the wind. You might wax lyrical about the unique texture of today's biscuit. Was it merely rock hard, or had it achieved the coveted fossilized rock hard status? You might even, in a fit of literary desperation, attempt to chronicle the ongoing, largely silent feud between two of the sledge dogs over a particularly desirable, slightly less frozen piece of dried fish. Future historians, you imagine with a grim chuckle, will marvel at our incredibly detailed descriptions of biscuit density variations and the profound philosophical implications of a slightly off-key, mournful sledge dog howl echoing across the frozen wastes. Or, more likely, they'll just use our painstakingly compiled journals as a highly effective, all-natural cure for stubborn bouts of insomnia. Could really go either way. But you write because you must. Because the expedition demands it. Because some part of you, however small and frost-nipped, still clings to the idea that recording this existence, however monotonous, gives it some sliver of meaning, some testament to your endurance. And so, with a final weary flourish of your pencil, you conclude another entry, another day captured in a few sparse, frozen words, before the logbook lethargy completely overwhelms you and the blankness of the page merges seamlessly with the blankness of the world outside. The last deeply uninspired entry in your logbook is complete, a testament to another day of nothing much to report. Still very cold. You carefully close the book, trying not to crack its frozen binding, and stow it away. The brief, chilly intellectual exertion is over. Now it's time to embrace a more robustly physical form of Arctic drudgery. You can hear the wind, that ever-present, mournful banshee of the polar wastes, picking up outside, and you know exactly what that means. It's time for the never-ending snow shovel shuffle, a dance as old as Arctic exploration itself, and about as much fun as trying to teach a walrus to play the ukulele. In this realm of white, snow is not just a picturesque backdrop, it is a relentless, insidious enemy. It doesn't just fall politely from the sky, it drifts, it swirls, it creeps, it pounces, maintaining clear access to shelters, storage depots, scientific instrument sites, and even basic sanitation facilities by regularly and laboriously shoveling vast quantities of accumulated and wind-driven snow was a constant, physically demanding, and absolutely critical necessity for the survival and functioning of all early 20th century Arctic expeditions, especially during the long winter months or frequent blizzards. If you don't keep on top of it, you can quite literally be buried alive, your hut transformed into a rather drafty snowdrift, your ventilation shafts choked, your escape route to the facilities becoming a matter of perilous excavation. Ah, snow shoveling. My favorite Arctic pastime, right after competitive frostbite severity counting and the ever-popular group activity of spot the singular non-white object in the immediate landscape. Spoiler alert, it's usually just more snow, but perhaps a slightly different, more existentially troubling shade of white. Armed with your trusty shovel, a heavy, broad-bladed affair that feels like it weighs roughly the same as a small, uncooperative reindeer, you brace yourself and step out into the swirling white chaos, or perhaps just the deceptively calm aftermath of last night's snowfall. The wind, of course, immediately tries to steal your breath and sandpaper your exposed skin with tiny ice crystals. You pull your muffler tighter, squint against the glare, and begin the rhythmic, back-breaking labor. Scoop, lift, turn, throw, scoop, lift, turn, throw. The snow itself varies in consistency, from light, fluffy powder that looks deceptively easy to move but simply blows straight back into your face, to heavy, wet, compacted stuff that feels like you're trying to excavate solidified concrete with a teaspoon. You clear a path from the hut door. You feel a brief, fleeting sense of accomplishment. Then, you watch as the wind, with a sort of casual, malicious artistry, immediately begins to fill it in again. The wind sees your meticulously cleared path. The wind, you imagine, chuckles to itself in a low, menacing gust and says, "Oh, how quaint a temporary man-made indentation, where I shall now thoughtfully deposit approximately 3 metric tons of fresh, fluffy, soul-crushing despair." It's a beautiful, if deeply one-sided and ultimately futile, collaboration with the elemental forces of nature to add a touch of fleeting, almost desperate artistic expression to this otherwise thankless task. Some of you have taken to creating ephemeral snow sculptures with the cleared snow. Last week, Henderson, who fancies himself a bit of a sculptor when he's not misplacing his mittens, crafted a surprisingly lifelike, if somewhat melancholic, snow effigy of the expedition leader, complete with a thoughtfully applied icicle monocle. It was quite the talking point, at least until the next blizzard subtly eroded its distinguished features, transforming it from stoic polar commander into slightly confused puddle of disappointment. It's these little creative rebellions, these quirky assertions of humanity against the overwhelming whiteness, that help to keep the spirit from freezing quite as solid as your beard. There's a certain grim strategy to it all. You learn to identify the prevailing wind directions, to build snow walls or windbreaks, which then, of course, create even larger drifts behind them. It's a complex aerodynamic game you can never truly win. You prioritize the hut entrance as paramount, followed by the air vents for the stove asphyxiation being generally frowned upon, even on budget-conscious expeditions, then perhaps the sites for the scientific instruments. And, of course, the well-trodden, if deeply uninviting, path to the latrine. Historians still argue, often with the aid of detailed meteorological charts and complex fluid dynamic software unknown to your era, whether the specific design, orientation, and placement of expedition-base huts in relation to prevailing winds and local topography were typically based on sophisticated, proactive meteorological understanding intended to minimize the impact of snowdrift accumulation, or if such crucial choices were more often dictated by immediate terrain constraints, the availability of suitable building sites, sheer luck, or sometimes just plain old heroic guesswork, leading to vastly differing degrees of the never-ending shoveling burden for different expeditions. Looking at the mountain of snow currently trying to swallow your hut's north wall, you have your own rather pointed opinions on the success of heroic guesswork in architectural planning. We're not just explorers, you reflect as you heave another shovel load of frozen misery into the wind, only to see half of it blow back over your shoulder. We're highly specialized, extremely cold, and chronically underappreciated snow relocation engineers. Our expedition motto, if we were being truly honest, should be we move it from here to slightly over there until the indifferent wind inevitably moves it back again. For science and to avoid being entombed. That's undeniably catchy. No. And so the snow shovel shuffle continues. A weary, repetitive dance with the elements. It's a battle you can never win, only temporarily postpone. Each cleared space is a fleeting victory, each new drift a fresh insult, but it must be done. It is the price of existence in this frozen world, another layer in the endless strata of dull, demanding chores that form the unglamorous bedrock of your grand Arctic adventure. Your muscles ache, your face is numb, but the doorway, for now, is clear. Until the next gust, of course. The last shovel load of freshly drifted snow has been heroically relocated from directly in front of the hut door to a point approximately 5 feet to the left, where the wind will, with cheerful malevolence, begin the process of blowing it straight back again within the hour. Your back aches, your face is numb, and your contribution to the ongoing battle against Arctic entropy is complete, at least for this particular skirmish. But there's no time to admire your fleeting handiwork, because another, more vocal, and distinctly more four-legged set of demands now requires your immediate attention. If your glorious expedition is fortunate enough, or depending on your current mood and the state of the fish supplies, unfortunate enough to employ sledge dogs, then canine care and kennel chores are next on your exciting polar itinerary. Sledge dogs, typically robust and cold-hardy breeds like Siberian Huskies, Alaskan Malamutes, or the incredibly resilient Greenland dogs, were absolutely indispensable to the success of many early 20th century Arctic, and indeed Antarctic expeditions, capable of hauling incredibly heavy loads of supplies and equipment over vast distances of snow and ice in conditions where men alone, or even ponies, would falter and fail. These aren't fluffy lapdogs, they are furry. Four-wheel drive engines of pure muscle and endurance, the true unsung heroes of polar travel. Their well-being is not just a matter of sentiment, it's a matter of your own survival and the expedition's ultimate success or failure. Time to attend to our esteemed colleagues, the ones who actually do most of the heavy pulling around here, but get paid entirely in portions of slightly rancid dried fish and the occasional grudging, frost-nipped pat on the head. It's a rough life. You reflect with a weary sigh, even for a hero dog destined for the history books, or at least a footnote in them. First, feeding time. This isn't a simple case of opening a bag of kibble. Their rations, much like yours, are designed for maximum energy and longevity, but minimal culinary delight. It's often dried fish, frozen solid as a Viking's curse, which needs to be laboriously hacked apart with an axe. Or it might be pemmican, specially formulated for dogs, or chunks of seal or walrus meat from the last successful hunt, also invariably frozen. You distribute the rations carefully, ensuring each dog gets its allotted share, which can be a surprisingly fraught process given the established, and often aggressively defended, pecking order within the pack. Dropped pieces vanish instantly in a flurry of snarls and snapping jaws. And, of course, they need water, which means yet more of your precious, hard-won melted ice, carefully doled out into frozen bowls. Then comes the less appealing, but equally necessary, aspect of kennel chores. The dogs are usually tethered outside, often in individual snow pits they dig for themselves or in designated lines. This means their biological byproducts also accumulate outside. And while the extreme cold does have the small mercy of freezing, said byproducts into solid, easily manageable if still deeply unglamorous projectiles, they still need to be periodically cleared away from the main living and working areas. The sheer, unadulterated glamour of polar exploration. You often muse as you meticulously chip a collection of frozen dog poo out of the impacted snow with a small, entirely inadequate shovel, all while trying not to make direct eye contact with the specific dog responsible, who is probably sitting there judging your technique with an air of serene, canine detachment. Harness maintenance is another endless task. Leather becomes brittle and cracks in the intense cold, canvas webbing frays, buckles freeze solid or snap. Before every journey, and often after, each harness must be meticulously inspected, repaired with stiff, numb fingers and coarse thread, and untangled from the Gordian knots that sledge dogs seem to delight in creating with their traces overnight. You also need to check their paws regularly for cuts, abrasions from rough ice, or the painful ice balls that can form between their pads, potentially crippling them if left unattended. This often involves a rather undignified wrestling match with a reluctant, furry patient who does not appreciate your well-intentioned but chilly ministrations. Old Mac McGregor, the expedition's quiet, grizzled dog handler and self-proclaimed canine psychoanalyst that claims he can interpret the subtle nuances of every dog's howl, bark, and mournful yodel. He's the one who insists that Fang isn't actually aggressive. He just has unresolved abandonment issues stemming from a traumatic puphood experience with a particularly aloof seal. I seek. He'll spend hours apparently counseling She-Wolf, who he believes suffers from a debilitating fear of Tuesdays and oddly shaped snowdrifts. You're fairly certain Mac has just spent a little too much time in the company of canines and not enough with well-adjusted humans. Not that there are many of those on this expedition either, but his ability to untangle a 5-dog trace pileup in a blizzard while humming a Gaelic lament is undeniably impressive. Old Blizzard, the lead dog, certainly has a particular multi-octave howl he reserves for when he strongly disapproves of your harness adjustments. It's a sound that eloquently and unmistakably says, "You, sir, are an incompetent, two-legged buffoon, and I shall now express my profound existential despair at being hitched to your demonstrable ineptitude via the ancient and sacred medium of high-pitched, mournful, and deeply embarrassing public yodeling." Historians still argue, often with considerable passion and conflicting ethnographic parallels, whether the pronounced hierarchical pecking order and sometimes brutal dominance displays observed within sledge dog teams during these expeditions were primarily a reflection of natural, ingrained canine pack behavior, simply exacerbated by the harsh, competitive conditions for limited resources, or if this social structure was significantly, if often unconsciously, shaped and influenced by the handling methods, feeding priorities, and even the unconscious biases of the human explorers who manage them. You, having just had your glove nearly removed by Cuddles, a dog whose name is a cruel, cosmic joke during a dispute over a fish head, are less concerned with the academic debate and more with keeping all your fingers. And so, the canine chores continue. Feeding, watering, scooping, untangling, mending, and the occasional attempt at interspecies diplomacy. It's smelly, it's cold, it's often frustrating, and it's invariably laborious. But as you look at these resilient, powerful animals, their breath pluming in the frigid air, their eyes bright with an ancient, wild intelligence, you know that your journey, your survival, your very presence in this unforgiving land depends almost entirely on their strength, their endurance, and your diligent, if unglamorous, care. They are your engines, your companions, and your furry, four-legged link to a more primal, elemental world. Now, if only Blizzard would stop judging your knot-tying skills so vocally. The last of the dog harnesses has been meticulously checked for frays and frozen buckles. The final mournful howl of Blizzard, the lead dog, with strong opinions on your knot-tying abilities, has faded into the vast, indifferent silence of the Arctic, and you've successfully avoided losing any fingers to either frostbite or an overly enthusiastic sledge dog with a passion for nibbling. A triumph of canine diplomacy and personal appendage preservation, but the day's technological challenges are far from over. Now, you turn your attention to another vital, often infuriating, and deeply temperamental member of the expedition, the Primus stove. Ah, the Primus, our beloved essential and frequently deeply neurotic. Little brass god of warmth and cooktish food? It's time for its morning or afternoon or evening, because this battle can occur multiple times a day session of prayerful performance, involving careful supplication, ritual sacrifices of methylated spirits, and your dwindling patience, and the silent, fervent, oft-repeated, please for the love of all that is holy and not frozen solid, don't explode in my face today dance. The Primus stove, a marvel of Swedish engineering invented in the late 19th century, was a revolutionary piece of equipment for polar expeditions of your early 20th century era. Burning paraffin kerosene vaporized under pressure, it provided a portable, relatively efficient, and surprisingly powerful heat source compared to the smoky, inefficient spirit lamps or open blubber fires of earlier ventures. It was essential for melting snow and ice for drinking water, cooking what passed for food, and providing a modicum of precious, life-sustaining warmth inside tents or cramped huts, though its operation, especially in extreme sub-zero temperatures, required considerable skill, patience, and a touch of what felt like arcane magic. This little brass contraption is the difference between lukewarm pemmican hoosh and just frozen pemmican. The difference between potable water and a desperate craving for something, anything, that isn't just more snow. Its successful operation is quite literally a matter of life and slightly less miserable death. But oh, the temperament of these metallic deities. Each Primus on the expedition seems to have its own distinct, often deeply frustrating, personality. You approach Betsy, your personal assigned Primus stove, or perhaps the communal one you're currently wrestling with a familiar mixture of cautious hope and profound trepidation. Betsy, you see, has moods, some days, with a bit of gentle coaxing and the correct sequence of ritualistic pumping and preheating. She'll roar to life like a tiny, well-behaved, and surprisingly efficient volcano, her blue flame a beacon of hope in the frozen gloom. Other days, Betsy sulks. She sputters. She flares up with alarming, beard-singeing gouts of yellow, sooty flame. She clogs her tiny jet with microscopic particles of who knows what that exist only to cause maximum frustration. She emits noxious, unignited paraffin fumes that could stun a particularly resilient musk ox at 50 paces and leave you with a headache that feels like tiny ice trolls are practicing their axe work inside your skull. The ritual of lighting a Primus in extreme cold is a delicate, multi-stage ballet of desperation and applied physics. First, the preheating. A small amount of methylated spirits is poured into a little dish beneath the burner and lit. This tiny, flickering flame is supposed to heat the vaporizer tube sufficiently so that when you start pumping pressure into the fuel tank, the paraffin will turn into a gas and ignite properly. The instruction manual, if you still possessed one and if its pages hadn't long ago been sacrificed for some other, more pressing expeditionary need, emergency toilet paper. Kindling. A very small and ineffective hat. Probably says something calm and reassuring like, gently preheat vaporizer tube for approximately 1 minute. Your lived experience, however, is more accurately described as frantically wave a sputtering, rapidly diminishing, meths-soaked asbestos wick in the general direction of the frozen brass bits while chanting ancient, largely improvised pleas to the long-forgotten spirit of efficient combustion and simultaneously trying to shield your eyebrows from instantaneous incineration. Once the preheating is deemed often optimistically sufficient, the pumping begins, forcing air into the fuel tank to pressurize the paraffin. Then, with a trembling hand, you crack open the valve. Will it be the satisfying, steady roar of a clean blue flame, or the dreaded, sputtering, yellow flare-up of doom, accompanied by clouds of oily black smoke that will instantly coat every surface in the hut with another layer of greasy despair? It's a moment of high drama. There's often a specific, quirky superstition attached to each stove by its primary user. Old Man Weatherby, for example, swears that his primus, Lucifer's breath, a name earned during a particularly memorable flare-up that nearly cost him his magnificent mustache, will only light if you first whistle 3 bars of a specific sea shanty and then offer it a silent, heartfelt apology for all previous operational failures. You're not entirely convinced of the efficacy of whistling to stubborn brass, but at this point, you're willing to try almost anything. Historians still argue, often in discussions fueled by strong coffee brewed on effortlessly modern appliances, whether the considerable psychological stress and gnawing anxiety induced by the frequent unreliability and temperamental nature of critical survival equipment like Primus stoves contributed more significantly to the erosion of overall expedition morale and the fraying of interpersonal relationships than even the more constant, predictable hardships such as the extreme cold, the monotonous diet, or the back-breaking physical labor. When Betsy is on one of her sputtering, uncooperative tantrums, and the prospect of a hot drink or a warm meal is rapidly receding into the frozen distance, you can definitely see how a faulty stove could push a man, or an entire expedition, towards the brink. The consequences of prolonged stove failure are dire. No hot food means trying to gnaw on frozen pemmican, a truly tooth-endangering experience. No melted snow means no drinking water, leading rapidly to dehydration, which is surprisingly easy even in this icy wasteland. And no source of even minimal heat inside the shelter means the cold seeps even deeper into your bones, making rest impossible and every small task a monumental effort. But then, after much cursing, coaxing, pricking of the tiny jet with a special needle which you inevitably drop into the snow at least twice, and perhaps a few more fervent, whispered promises to any listening deities of flame and pressurized paraffin, there's that magical moment. A sputter, a cough, then a steady, reassuring hiss, and finally, the beautiful, clean, blue roar of a Primus stove operating at peak efficiency. The relief is immense, almost disproportionate. A small, localized circle of warmth begins to spread. The promise of hot tea, of thawed food, of melted water, returns. Another small, frustrating, but absolutely essential victory has been snatched from the icy, indifferent jaws of the Arctic. Betsy has decided to cooperate, for now. The Primus stove, your beloved fickle brass deity, Betsy, is finally purring with a steady, reassuring blue flame. A small circle of warmth and hope in the vast, frozen indifference of your hut. You've managed to melt enough ice for a round of lukewarm, slightly sooty tea, and perhaps even to thaw out a chunk of that morning's pemmican into something resembling a lukewarm, slightly sooty stew. A veritable feast. But even as you sip your tea, a new, more insidious kind of chill begins to creep into your thoughts. A chill that has nothing to do with the ambient temperature. It's the gnawing anxiety of dwindling resources, the ever-present specter of scarcity. And so, with the grim determination of a man facing his own meticulously itemized doom, you prepare for another essential, if deeply uncheering, routine. Counting crumbs, also known as the daily inventory anxiety attack. In this isolated, unforgiving wasteland, your supplies are not just provisions, they are your lifeline, the finite thread connecting you to survival. Food, the aforementioned pemmican, the rock-hard biscuits, the precious tins of bully beef or condensed milk, fuel paraffin for the Primus, oil for the lamps. Perhaps a meager stash of coal or salvaged wood, medical supplies, bandages, antiseptics, the dwindling bottle of laudanum, ammunition for hunting and, one hopes not, for defense, even seemingly mundane items like matches, candles, and sewing needles. Each item is a tiny bulwark against disaster. Accurate and painstakingly regular inventory management was an absolutely crucial, non-negotiable element for the long-term survival and potential success of virtually all early 20th century polar expeditions. Resupply was often impossible for months, sometimes even years, and any significant miscalculation, unexpected loss, or spoilage of essential supplies could, and frequently did, have catastrophic, life-threatening consequences. There's no popping down to the corner shop if you run out of tea or paraffin here. Every biscuit counted out, every drop of fuel consumed is a step closer to, well, you try not to think too much about that. The chore itself is as tedious as it is vital. It involves venturing into the designated storeroom, perhaps a separate, even colder tent, a section of the ship's hold if you're icebound, or a carefully constructed snow cave, a frigid, dimly lit Aladdin's cave of carefully stacked boxes, tins, and barrels. You work by the flickering light of a hurricane lamp, your breath pluming around you, your fingers quickly numbing as you handle frozen metal containers and pry open wooden crates. You meticulously count tins of pemmican, sacks of biscuits, tapping each one to dislodge any stowaway weevils before tallying, drums of paraffin, boxes of matches. Each item is checked off against the master inventory ledger, a dog-eared, grease-stained volume that is arguably the most important, and certainly the most depressing book on the entire expedition. Time for everyone's favorite evening fireside game played. Naturally. Without an actual fireside, count the remaining biscuits and try not to weep openly into your frozen beard. Bonus points are awarded if you can make each individual precious biscuit last for at least 3 entirely imaginary, multi-course gourmet meals in your head before you actually consume it. The quartermaster. Poor fellow, let's call him Worthington. A man whose once cheerful disposition has slowly been eroded by the constant, soul-crushing mathematics of impending starvation, now possesses a permanent facial expression that's a delightful, if deeply unsettling, blend of imminent famine looms and I explicitly told the committee we should have packed at least another 3 tons of tea. But did they listen? Oh. He's aged approximately 3 decades in the last 6 months. Most of it, you suspect, during these nightly inventory sessions. As the weeks and months grind on, and the neatly stacked piles inevitably shrink, a palpable anxiety begins to pervade the entire expedition. Rations are calculated and recalculated with obsessive precision. Every spoonful of sugar, every biscuit, every lump of pemmican becomes a subject of intense, if unspoken, scrutiny. Decisions about rationing, when to cut, how much to cut, are fraught with tension, balancing the need to conserve with the need to maintain strength and morale. To cope with the bleak reality of the dwindling official stores, you and a few of your more imaginative messmates have developed a quirky, private ritual, the phantom food inventory. After Worthington has completed his grim tally of actual, tangible supplies, you gather around the stove and, with mock solemnity and much elaborate flourishing of imaginary ledgers, conduct an inventory of all the delicious, utterly non-existent foods you wish you had. Right, lads. Someone will begin. Item 1 5 dozen freshly baked, still warm sourdough loaves with lashings of Devonshire clotted cream, all present and accounted for in our collective desires. I comes the hearty, if slightly hollow, response. It's a small, absurd act of defiance against the tyranny of the tangible. Historians still argue, often analyzing the meticulous, sometimes heartbreakingly detailed ration lists and expedition logs, whether the extreme and often prolonged rationing implemented on some of the more desperate expeditions, while clearly intended to prolong physical survival, inadvertently hastened a more profound physical and psychological decline by severely lowering morale, increasing interpersonal friction, and diminishing the men's capacity for strenuous work, to a greater extent than perhaps slightly more generous, but also potentially much riskier. In terms of longevity, consumption rates might have done. It's a grim equation, one you hope your own expedition leader is calculating with something resembling divine wisdom. Because your personal mathematical skills tend to falter when confronted with the prospect of dividing half a biscuit by 3 hungry men for 7 more weeks. Our current paraffin supply, you note with a familiar lurch in your stomach as Worthington makes another tiny, depressing mark in his ledger, is looking particularly anemic, skeletal, even. There was a rather spirited, if ultimately fruitless kind of discussion last night around the Primus, which was, of course, burning precious fuel during the debate regarding a new, innovative energy conservation policy, vigorous, synchronized, and enthusiastic shivering as a primary ambient heat source for the hut. The dogs, might who overheard, looked deeply skeptical. But then again, they don't get a vote on official fuel allocation strategy. Probably for the best. And so, the counting of the crumbs concludes for another day. The ledger is updated, a new baseline of anxiety established. This obsessive but repetitive checking is a constant, underlying hum of worry beneath the more overt daily chores. A daily reminder of your profound isolation, your complete dependence on these finite resources, and the thin, fraying rope that connects you to the world you left behind. Every small comfort, every hot drink, every meager meal is now subtly shadowed by the knowledge of its diminishing source. The ledgers are closed. The last biscuit has been sorrowfully accounted for, and the gnawing anxiety of your dwindling supplies has been temporarily shelved, only to be revisited with fresh, neurotic intensity tomorrow. You've successfully navigated the emotional minefield of inventory management, and what rewarding, uplifting chore awaits you now as a delightful palate cleanser. Yes, it's time for that most glamorous, most celebrated, and most frequently omitted from heroic. Narratives of all expeditionary duties a visit to, and perhaps some light maintenance of the Arctic privy, or as you and your companions have affectionately and with a hefty dose of gallows humor nicknamed it, the throne room of the frost giants. The altar of frozen regret, or more simply, that particularly chilly, exposed hole over there that we all try to visit as infrequently as humanly possible. Let's be clear, we are not talking about a charmingly rustic outhouse with a quaint crescent moon carved into the door. We are not even talking about a basic trench latrine with a modicum of privacy. Sanitation facilities on early 20th century Arctic expeditions, when they existed in any designated form at all, were typically extremely rudimentary, often consisting of little more than an open pit dug in the snow or ice, or a specifically designated area some uncomfortable distance downwind from the main shelter. Waste froze quickly, mitigating some olfactory offenses, but its eventual disposal, especially if the expedition was stationary for long periods like being frozen in for the winter, posed a significant and unpleasant challenge. This is a chore that truly makes you appreciate the subtle architectural nuances, and indeed the very existence of a well-built, three-sided outhouse back home. Or, just any outhouse, with walls, and perhaps a door. Luxuries. The first part of this delightful experience is the perilous path itself. The journey to the designated spot, often 100 yards or so from the hut to maintain a sliver of, shall we say, aromatic distance, is an expedition in miniature. In the perpetual twilight or the inky blackness of the polar night, you trudge through snowdrifts, remember all that shoveling you did earlier. The wind has already artfully rearranged it, leaning into the biting wind that seems to view your exposed nether regions as a personal challenge. Every step is a gamble against frostbite in places you'd really rather not experience frostbite. The expedition's unofficial motto for privy visits, often muttered through chattering teeth, has become be bold, be brave, be brief, very, very brief. And for the love of all that is warm, try not to make direct, prolonged eye contact with any passing Arctic foxes or particularly judgmental-looking penguins who might be silently critiquing your life choices that led you to this specific, drafty moment. The facility itself is a monument to minimalist design. Perhaps it's a snow-walled enclosure, offering the slightest illusion of privacy from your companions, though certainly not from the all-seeing, indifferent gaze of the Arctic sky. Or maybe it's just a designated patch of disturbingly yellowed snow. The act of using it is an exercise in speed, efficiency, and a sort of desperate, full-body clenching against the ferocious cold. You learn to perform the necessary operations with the swift precision of a surgeon who is also simultaneously trying to win a race against hypothermia. Thoughts of leisurely contemplation, of peacefully perusing a tattered magazine, are laughably absurd. This is about survival, pure and simple. And then there's the maintenance. If a pit has been dug, it will eventually fill a frozen tableau of past discomforts. A new one must then be excavated from the rock-hard permafrost or unyielding ice. A task that makes chopping ice for water seem like a delightful frolic in a spring meadow. Or if it's a surface deposit system, then a periodic, deeply unpleasant clearing out might be necessary, involving shovels and a strong stomach, and a profound sense of having reached a new low in your polar career. Historians still argue, often with a certain academic detachment, that you, currently contemplating the icy abyss, find mildly enviable, whether the significant and often underestimated health risks posed by inadequate sanitation practices and the potential for contamination of nearby snow intended for meltwater sources were fully understood and adequately mitigated by the leaders of these early expeditions, or if these very real dangers were frequently overshadowed by, or simply accepted as secondary to, the more immediate and dramatic threats of extreme cold. Starvation, or becoming irretrievably lost. You just hope that the spot chosen for water ice is a very, very long way upwind from the spot chosen for, well, for this. To lighten the mood, or perhaps just to document the sheer misery for posterity. Your expedition boasts a latrine laureate, young Weatherby, the assistant geologist, who has a quirky, if somewhat morbid, talent for composing mournful odes and tragicomic verses about the daily trials of Arctic defecation. His latest masterpiece, Ode to a Frozen Posterior, recited with much theatrical shivering around the Primus stove last night, was a particular triumph of bleak humor. Though it did rather put everyone off their evening pemmican, it's these little shared moments of gallows wit, these communal acknowledgments of the absurdly unglamorous, that help you endure. We've even collectively named our current privy the Temple of Quiet Contemplation and Deeply Held Regret. Mostly regret? Especially when the wind unexpectedly changes direction mid-contemplation, bringing with it a sudden, unwelcome reminder of previous offerings? The grim, necessary pilgrimage to the Temple of Quiet Contemplation and Deeply Held Regret has been successfully navigated. And you've returned to the relative, and I use that term with the loosest possible definition. Comfort of the hut. Perhaps with a few extra ice crystals adorning your person, and a renewed appreciation for the simple, uncelebrated miracle of indoor plumbing back in civilization. This particular chore, so rarely detailed in the heroic penny dreadfuls or the stirring lantern slide lectures that inspire young men to seek glory in frozen wastelands, is perhaps one of the most challenging, most humbling, and most undeniably, fundamentally human aspects of daily polar survival. It's a stark, olfactory challenged reminder of your shared vulnerability in this vast, indifferent, and extremely drafty frozen world. Your dignity may have taken a slight hit, but your bladder, at least, is no longer staging a mutiny. Small mercies. The last and arguably most character-building of the day's essential chores has been ticked off your mental list. You've braved the temple of quiet contemplation and deeply held regret, and returned, if not entirely refreshed, then at least functionally relieved. As you trudge back towards the faint, flickering light and smoky warmth of the hut, What passes for evening in this timeless and frozen realm begins to settle around you. If the sun is still a participant in your daily drama at this latitude and season, you watch it perform its slow, reluctant descent, painting the endless, indifferent icebergs a lovely, if rather melancholic, shade of please for the love of all the frost-bitten saints. Don't make me get up and do all of this again in 6 hours. It's all very artistic in its palpable, silent despair. If it's the long polar night, then evening is simply a collectively agreed upon fiction, a time when the main blubber lamp is trimmed, the Primus stove perhaps given one last sputtering roar for the evening hoosh, and the day's relentless, soul-grinding labor is officially declared done. For now, you slump onto your hard bunk, or perhaps a designated crate if bunk space is at a premium, and the full weight of the day's accumulated drudgery settles upon you like a thick, damp, and slightly mildewed woolen blanket. In your mind's eye, you see a flickering montage of the hours just past, the aching cold of awakening with frozen toes, the rhythmic, jarring thud of the ice axe, the greasy, monotonous taste of pemmican, the sticky, frozen misery of sledge grease on your numb fingers, the futile battle against hut grime, the acrid, all-pervading stench of rendering blubber, the endless, eye-straining dance of the darning needle, the mind-numbing repetition of thermometer readings, the blank, accusing stare of the logbook page, the Sisyphean struggle against drifting snow, the yelping, fish-scented chaos of dog feeding, the prayerful, anxiety-ridden performance of coaxing the Primus stove to life, the grim mathematics of dwindling supplies, and finally, that bracing, character-affirming visit to the outdoor facilities. Another glorious day in the service of science, empire, and a profound, deepening appreciation for warm, dry socks. Successfully endured. You haven't conquered much today, unless you count that particularly stubborn block of ice for the morning water pot, or perhaps your own rising tide of existential dread. But you have, most definitely, survived. The main difference, you reflect with a weary internal chuckle, is that conquering usually involves significantly less prolonged discussion about the structural integrity of repeatedly darned and still stubbornly frozen socks. Evening entertainment, such as it is, now commences in the smoky, cramped, and human fug-thick atmosphere of the hut. Henderson, who fancies himself the expedition's naturalist when he's not misplacing vital pieces of equipment, is attempting to teach a particularly lethargic and quite possibly long-dead weevil he apparently found still clinging to life or undeath in his afternoon biscuit to perform a complex tap dance routine on an upturned pemmican tin. So far, the weevil is demonstrating remarkable restraint and a distinct, almost defiant, lack of rhythm. The suspense, as you can imagine, is palpable. Someone else might be attempting to read by the flickering, insufficient lamplight, their face a mask of strained concentration. Quiet. Desultory conversations ebb and flow, mostly revolving around the weather still cold, the food still pemmican, or increasingly fantastical reminiscences of decent meals eaten years ago in places that actually possessed sunshine and trees. As the evening wears on, a quiet, almost ritualistic tradition has emerged among you and your companions, the official end-of-day collective sigh. It's not planned, not announced, it just happens. One man will let out a long, slow, heartfelt exhalation, a sound that seems to carry all the weariness and monotony of the day. Then another will echo it, then another, until a soft chorus of profound, shared resignation fills the hut. It's your quirky, unspoken acknowledgement of another 24 hours or what passes for them successfully navigated. Another identical set of dull duties completed, and the bleak, unshakable certainty that tomorrow will bring only more of the exact same. The psychological resilience of individual explorers and the cohesive or sometimes dangerously fractured social dynamics within the group were often as absolutely critical to the survival and ultimate outcome of these long, arduous expeditions as physical fitness, navigational skill, or the quality of their equipment. Factors like leadership, individual temperament, the ability to find meaning or distraction in routine, and the capacity to cope with extreme, prolonged monotony played enormously significant roles in determining who thrived, who merely endured, and who, tragically, did not. That collective sigh is heavy with unspoken thoughts. The longing for home, for comfort, for variety, for purpose beyond the next repetitive chore. Historians still argue, when poring over the published narratives and the private, often more candid, diaries of these expeditions, whether the triumphant tales of discovery and the emphasis on conquering adversity, so prevalent in the accounts presented to the public by surviving expedition leaders, accurately portray the daily realities and the prevailing, often despairing or deeply apathetic, mood of the men throughout the long, dark months of hardship. Or they question if these narratives represent a necessary, perhaps even a partially self-deceptive, romanticization and heroic reframing, designed to justify the immense human and material costs involved, both to the eager public back home and, just as crucially, to the explorers themselves, as a way of making sense of their often profound suffering. Looking around at the tired, soot-stained faces of your companions, their eyes reflecting the dim, flickering lamplight, you have your own theories on that particular debate. And so, with the final echoing sigh still hanging in the frigid air, you begin the nightly ritual of preparing for what passes for bed, which mostly involves adding another layer of already damp clothing, checking your sleeping bag for any unwelcome ice formations, and offering a silent, fervent prayer that you won't actually freeze solid before morning. None. The golden glow of adventure has long since tarnished, replaced by the dull, leaden weight of endless, identical tomorrows, each promising only more cold, more pemmican, and more of the same old, wearying, surprisingly dull chores. The long, monotonous day in the vast, frozen wilderness is finally drawing to its inevitable close. The Primus stove, if it was coaxed into one last performance for a meager evening meal, has likely sputtered its last for the night, its faint warmth already being greedily devoured by the insatiable Arctic cold. The sounds within your cramped shelter, the hut, the tent, the ice-locked ship, diminish to the soft rustle of men shifting in their sleeping bags, the occasional cough, the ever-present sigh of the wind outside, a mournful, ceaseless lullaby. Allow the feeling of that profound, bone-deep chill, the weariness of endless, repetitive labor, the taste of monotonous food, and the heavy weight of isolation to gently begin to recede from your mind now. You are no longer that early 20th century explorer, battling the elements and the even more formidable foe of crushing boredom. Your own day, with its own unique challenges and small comforts, is also coming to an end. But it is a day that, unlike his, will surely be followed by a tomorrow, offering fresh possibilities and welcome change. Let the stark, white landscapes of the Arctic soften and dissolve, replaced by the familiar, comforting darkness of your own quiet room. The biting wind fades, and in its place, you hear only the soft, rhythmic sounds of your own peaceful environment. Perhaps the gentle hum of a fan, the distant murmur of your own world settling down for the night, the concerns of survival in a frozen wasteland, the endless quest for warmth, for water, for sustenance, the meticulous counting of dwindling crumbs can now be laid aside. You have journeyed through a day of their surprisingly dull chores, and you have, in your own way, endured. Feel the comfort of your own bed, the warmth of your own blankets, a luxury beyond the wildest dreams of those hardy, often despairing souls. Appreciate the simple and profound pleasure of knowing that when you awaken, your toes will likely not be frozen. Your breakfast will offer some variety, and your day will not be an exact, unyielding replica of the one before. Rest now, deeply and peacefully. Let the silence of your own night be a true solace. not a reminder of isolation. The story of those surprisingly dull Arctic chores is complete, and your own journey into sleep can now begin, filled with the promise of a tomorrow that is blessedly, wonderfully, all your own.